We're going to turn it over to Eric, and Eric, I'm going to let you take it here and go with Robert and let you run the program from there. Have a good day, folks.
Sounds good. Thank you, Phil. I'm going to make myself primary. Hi, I'm Eric Mesner, Vice President in charge of programming. So we've got hopefully a good one for you today. Bob Burns is speaking to us. Bob, I don't know actually how long he's been keeping bees, but he's one of the smartest beekeepers I know, so it's got to be a long time. Last story I remember Bob sharing with me about his bees this year was that, correct me if I'm wrong, Bob, you said you sent about 85 colonies into winter and had 0 losses. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but that's the kind of guy that we want to listen to. And he's sharing a story with us today about genetics within the hive. So put your thinking cap on. I think it's going to be stimulating. And Robert, thank you for joining us.
Great, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Is my sound coming through now?
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay. So what I'll do is I will get started on a PowerPoint presentation. This was something I actually put together several years ago. I've added some new pictures to it and tried to practice a little bit in the last couple of days, but we'll get started here. So this is what I'm calling honeybee genetics, and I've been raising my own queens for the last 15 years, and for about 20 years I've been raising drones, and so genetics is a good subject I think that people should know about and be aware of, and we'll see how it goes here. So starting off with question, why is it so strange that female bees can produce drones? The drones can never have sons, and the drones can have grandsons. So welcome to what's called haploid diploid, which means single versus double copy. This is sex determinate, and this is how most bees, ants, and wasps, but not all of them, work. So males are the clones of their mothers. What I'm trying to do here is just give you some general guidelines and explain how this works to the best of my ability. Like a lot of us, it's been a number of years since we've had a biology class or genetics class in high school or community college or college. So the description is for honeybees, haploid diploid or haploid diploidy. So it's a sex determination system. And again, that haploid is single, diploid means double. And we're talking about if you're haploid, having a single set of unpaired chromosomes. Those would be, if you think of it this way, unfertilized eggs, which would be drones, and diploid would be 2 different chromosomes, one provided from an egg and one provided from a sperm, 2 different parents, and so that would be diploid. So picture of honeybees, a lot of times when you look at your bees, this one doesn't have a lot of, can anybody tell me what race of bees they think this is? I'm sorry, we're probably on mute, but this pretty much is, if you look at the bees and you know what to look for, they're pretty much all Italians. I don't see any Carniolan looking workers in here. But I put together, started 15 years ago, so with a simple spreadsheet, and I've kind of complicated it, but this is what my development spreadsheet looks like. And so I'm sure you're all aware, the drone, worker, and queen bee eggs all start out the same, and their stage development is lasting 3 days. The difference between queen and workers is the difference between brood jelly or royal jelly. Of course, drones also are fed the same brood jelly that workers are, and the brood jelly is important. for development. And in honeybees, it's one of the ways that the different food type has an effect on the larva and how it will mature. So it has an effect on the genes and will change the morphology or how the workers or the queens would come out differently. So it's important to understand that although the eggs are 3 days, the larval development stage between the queen, worker, and drones are all very different, just by a matter of day or a day and a half. For example, the queen bees are in the larval stage for only 5 days. Workers are about 5.5, and drones are 6.5. And then just for emphasis and explaining that the difference between worker and queen has to do with the type of food, which is the royal jelly or worker jelly or brood jelly. And what happens is that if you're raising queens, it needs to be from a fertilized egg or from a worker cell. The drones won't work. That by the third larval stage, or day 6 from when that egg is laid, there's a juvenile hormone switch that, depending on the type of food it's getting, will determine how that larva is going to continue developing, whether it's going to be a queen or a worker. So that's why we always have to pick larvae to be from the hatched, not an egg, but from the youngest stage that we can get. Because if you get it too old, by the 3rd day, even if you fed it, royal jelly, it's never going to come out as a good, well-developed, fully developed egg-laying mother queen. So by the time it's a 3-day-old larva, is basically too old, so it's too late. These are some small larvae that I recently used this spring, just to show you. I switched to these wax caps instead of the plastic cells, and I think I had much better take. The bees like the wax. But so what the royal jelly does is it's a sex determiner, and it's a protein. The royal jelly is a higher protein than the regular brood jelly. And so what it actually does is on a fertilized egg, it causes them to develop an ovipositor, which is essentially the stinger and venom. And it only takes one copy. What I was trying to refer there is the haploid or the unfertilized egg with the brood jelly and the food that they get. It helps them with developing the boy parts, which, believe it or not, the testes and the sperm development is actually done during the larval stage, but it also gives them the big eyes and the big abdomen. And workers, though, it's a little more complicated with them when they start to lay eggs, because without a queen, there's more information where you can find out about honeybee genetics, and I put a link down here. It's askentomologist.com is where I got some of this for this presentation. And this is just a picture of a queen just hatching out. It's a swarm cell, and you can see right next to it is a drone, and it's orange. You don't see the head very well because he's kind of tucked in there, but at least on this frame, you've got all 3 casts of bees. And does anybody know how you can tell what race or species or that this drone is? Typically, it's the orange ones are Italian as we know it. The black ones would be, for us, primarily Carniolan. Here's another slide. This one I just took yesterday. This hive was about ready to swarm. But you can see two different races of bees here. The orange-looking drone in the very center, it would be Italian. There's a couple drones up to the left and center. The dark ones would be Carniolan. The workers, there are different variations of Italians, and some, like over there for the very far right, of course, is an Italian that's kind of a medium banded. It's got more orange to it. Just to the left of there, a little ways, maybe inch or so, is a worker with a dark abdomen. That would be a Carniolan type. So the queen in this colony is basically half and half. Since drones come out representing the genetics of the queen, if she were 100% Italian, all the drones would have been orange. But these appear to be about half and half. So this queen's half Carniolan. I don't know what she looks like, but she probably looks Italian, but she's definitely half Italian, half Carniolan. But you can tell by the color of your drones what your queen is. Back to the same picture. A few minutes later, this queen that came out of the cell at the bottom is moved up towards the center. It's a virgin queen. This gives a good picture of a couple different types of drones, what it looks like. Primarily, they're Italian. I do see some Carniolans. The Carniolan drones would have a little more black on them, actually a lot more black. There's one in the top center, just a little bit to the left, but the other drones, you can see some black on them, but they still have orange. Those would still be Italians. They're just a darker banded Italian. Interestingly enough, there is a mite on one of these drones over up to the far right. You can see a mite right on the thorax of the drone, just barely. It's another picture of various, well, it should be various types of races in the same hive, but it's not. These are all primarily Italians. They're different banded Italians. To me, you'll see some that are more orange. And what we'll talk about in a little while is how they're all related, sisters versus super sisters and half sisters. So a few definitions, just to go over them real quick. An allele, when we're talking about genes, is a version of gene, say for instance, like colors. In humans, for example, you have an allele or a gene that affects eye color. It could be blue or brown or dark brown or green. So that's just a different gene version. Phenotype is the physical expression of a gene. And I like to remember this is like the PH stands for physical. So it's something you can see, or it's a behavior. And a genotype, that would be a set of genes for specific traits. That's something you cannot see. That's just how the chemical, that's just how the genes are set up. So genotype you wouldn't be able to see except perhaps under a microscope, but nobody would have that type. But phenotype is physical. So you remember physical for phenotype and genotype for the description of the genes. And then traits are specific characteristics of that organism. So here's an example. The genotype, the way that the genetic code is spelled out in the DNA strand is the big part of this picture of the chromosome. And phenotype down at the bottom, that's your properties, your observable properties. So that could be physical or behavioral. So how it looks, and that would be phenotype. So just a picture of the bee genes on a screen. So more descriptions. DNA is the protein block. Haploid diploid is the single versus double copy of the genetics. And if you think of the unfertilized egg would be haploid, those would be drones, and then diploid would be a fertilized egg contribution of the egg with the sperm. And then a genome is just the genetic material, and the chromosomes are in the nucleus and the mitochondria. Mitochondria are in the cells, but we're only going to refer to anything in this talk as having to do with the nucleus. So the unique thing about diploid, haploid diploid, and the way that bees use this as it's their characteristic for their sex determination, is that it increases the relatedness of the bees in a colony. So you'll have some bees that are more related to each other than others that aren't. And so the traits that can be passed on in honeybees can be physical, and they can be behavioral, how they act. So the expression of those traits are things that you could see. They're also in the genetics, what we refer to as dominant and recessive. On the dominant side, those are genes that are expressed that we can see either in their behavior or how they look. And recessive genes are those, we can see those also, but we don't see them as often, and that's because if they're combined, if you have a dominant trait and a recessive, a dominant gene and a recessive gene together, the dominant is what's going to be expressed unless that gene combination are both recessive, and then we'll see those. But more often than not, what we see in the behavior and the physical traits, if there is a dominant side, we will see those. And I'll go into some examples of more of what's recessive and dominant. So, but traits are the specific characteristics of an organism. So that can be influenced by genetics or the environment or both. So there are some physical traits that you can see in bees. One of them is tongue length. We have some species of bees that have longer tongues than others. For example, the Caucasian bee from the Caucasus Mountain areas, they have a longer tongue. I'd like to get a hold of some of those. They used to be all around the United States, but they're still working on perhaps bringing those back commercially. But for example, they could probably take nectar from red clover or other plants that have a longer corolla to get nectar out of, whereas Italians and Carniolans aren't able to do that because their tongues are shorter. The body color, again, we've seen a lot of those expressed in some of the drones and the workers. The pictures I've shown, those can be, that's a physical trait. And one I have never really seen is a white eye color. So most of all the bees I've seen have black, so I've never really seen a white eye color. It's a recessive trait, but it's not very common. I've never seen it in my lifetime, but I've seen it in pictures, but that's all. But that's an example of a physical trait. The other part is the striping. You can see this on queens, and you can see it on workers and drones too, but primarily this picture represents, I think, queens. We've got those tiger striped Italians and some that aren't striped at all or barely. But this is be an example of a physical trait too. So this graph, or this graphic, I'll just start up in the upper upper left corner. And this is just showing on eye color, for example, being a recessive trait. I've got, if my arrow shows up here, this is a queen on the left side with 2 black eyes and a drone with wide-eyed, the wide-eyed being a recessive trait. And this is a normal queen that has the dominant trait with black eyes. So if you cross those, now the queen's divided in half. Oh, let me go back. Queen's divided in half because remember she's coming from, she's got 2 sets of chromosomes, one from the drone, or fertilized egg, the sperm, and one from a fertilized egg. And then the drone is just a clone of the queen that he came from. So if by using mathematics, if you crossed a dominant trait queen on both sides with a recessive trait, you're going to come up with all of her drones expressing the black eyes, because it being a dominant trait, you wouldn't see the physical trait of that showing up. The workers would come out showing, because they inherit part of their genes from the queen and the other part from the sperm, that they would come out showing the dominant trait, so you would never see the black eye. I mean the wide eye, only the black. And then any other queens that came out of that also being the same would not show, and would show the recessive wide-eye gene. So sorry, keep clicking the wrong thing. Let me move something so I can get that out of the way. So over to the right, you've got a situation here where the queen is half and half. She's somehow inherited a wide-eyed gene, which is recessive, and a black-eyed gene, which is dominant. And she's crossed with a wide-eyed drone. Well, her offspring, when she laid the drones, half of them would come out with the black eyes and half would come out with the wide eyes. And they would, the wide-eyed drones would of course carry that gene on to the next generation, and her workers would come out the same, 50-50. And any queens that would come out from that too would be expressing 50-50. Half would come out with the recessive trait, and the other half would be expressing the dominant trait, but you wouldn't know that she's carried recessive, but you probably could figure it out. In the bottom left-hand corner, we're showing a queen that's got both genes for the wide-eyed, which is recessive, and the black-eyed drone. And so all of her drones would be coming out with wide eyes, and the workers and any queen's offspring would be coming out showing black eyes, but they would still be carrying the white recessive gene. So the next frame, the second, the final right quarter, same thing. The queen is, well, it's different, but the queen has a 50-50. She inherited the gene for the black eyes and also for the wide eyes. And so her offspring coming out for her drones would half would express the black eye and half would express the wide eye. So this is just an example of recessive versus dominant genes. Has anybody else ever seen any wide-eyed bees? I never have. So you can have polygenic traits, meaning many multiple genes. And that's where it could be influenced by more than one gene type. For example, in people, we have skin, hair, and eye color, and height as well. And so then we end up with different geno and phenotypes, again, genetic combinations and physical combinations. That's why you can have tall and short people in the same family. But those kind of traits where you have multiple genetic factors, for example, one has to do with Varroa sensitive genes, and that's related to uncapping brood. Another set is for removing larvae. And then we have others that are more orientated towards the disease part, like foul brood and chalk brood. And so then those combinations, you get a lot of different genome and phenotypes. The problem is they're hard to keep because sometimes those are recessive traits. And so while they've been able to isolate them in different bee yards and they can produce queens for them, once we get them, they don't last because they fly off and swarm, and it's hard to find those. So coming back to the questions that I started with in the first part of the program, why is it so strange that females can produce drones, that drones never have sons, and the drones can have grandsons? Well, I hope this kind of helps explain it. So since haploid diploidy is the sex determination system, there's a little math involved in trying to figure out how they're all related. So drones are all related 100% to the queen. Since they come from an unfertilized egg, they come from the queen's genetic material only. So there's no father involved, but they do have a grandfather that created the queen. So they're all full brothers to each other. But remember, the queen came from a fertilized egg and a sperm. So she's only 50% related to each drone and each worker. But essentially, she's the drone's genetic father, since there is no direct father. So they have daughters, but no sons. The drones have daughters, but no sons. So there are some other behavioral traits that can be passed on to bees. And you may have noticed sometimes if you've got multiple colonies, some are much better at hoarding nectar. Some gather a lot more pollen. Others produce a lot more propolis. And then you have a grooming behavior. For example, in the 90s, when we first had problems with tracheal mites, it seems like that's a dominant trait for handling the tracheal mites, and it didn't take very long for the bees to outgrow it. But we also have varroa mite behaviors, which involve uncapping the cells, and a different one for removing brood. All that's influenced by genetics. This demonstration is just to give you an idea on how color is involved and how recessive and dominant traits are affected. So to try to explain this, in case everybody doesn't know what Cordovan color is, Cordovan is I like to refer to it as blonde. They're the blonde reddish bees, very light colored. It's an Italian trait. And we have a few breeders in California that just like to do Italian bees. But Cordovan is the way we describe it. And for example, this over here on the left in the box is a yellow box with a queen in it. This queen is representing that she has inherited both the color recessive trait from the egg that she came from, and also the sperm that she came from, and that's the yellow in her tail, both sides of it. And so what her offspring would represent to the left in the other yellow box would be drones that are all expressing her color recessive Cordovan gene. Then any workers that she would produce, because she crossed with the drone that is the dark color, would be expressing half the Cordovan trait and half the dark trait or regular color. And any queens that would come out would be the same. But being that the color is a dominant trait, that's what you would see. You wouldn't see the color or recessive trait. But you could tell by the drones. Over on the right side is showing a queen that is 50-50. One part of her is expressing that she inherited the recessive trait for Cordovan color and the regular color, and her drones would come out 50-50. Part would be Cordovan and part would be the regular dark color. So I hope that helps a little bit and you're all still with me. If she crossed with a drone, for example, that was Cordovan, then the offspring that would come out would be 50-50 Cordovan and also regular color. And any queens would be the same. This is a picture of more drones. So in my operation, I usually leave a frame or two in the brood box. You can see some of the different races of bees just on this frame here. Quite a few are Italian. You can see them with the orange bands. And then there are a couple like up in the upper left corner that are dark banded. Those would be Carniolan. So this queen is has a mix of either sperm, but she must also be part, she's not 100% Italian, even though I don't know what she looks like. More bees. However, in this picture, they're all looking Italian. They're all orange striped. Well, I see a couple maybe in the very center. It's a little bit fuzzy picture. I do see a Carniolan type, and over to the left a little bit, there's another Carniolan type. So these sisters, they're all related in some way, but the Italians are more related to each other than the Carniolans. The Carniolans are related to each other. If we're just presuming that there's only one or two drones that the queen mated with. So just to talk about, you know, for your understanding why this is all important, you may be interested in trying to improve your own stock, or when you buy it, queens, then you'll know what the queen breeders are going through when they talk about their improvements in their stock production. So I basically, I don't choose my queens to raise queens from every year from the same colonies, and I also don't produce drones from all of my colonies either. I like to be picky, and so I just allow some brood production in some of my colonies, and I have frames that I basically don't use foundation, or sometimes if I'm using plastic foundation when I catch swarms, I will maybe cut it to 1/3 and just stick in. But I found over the years that if you give the bees an opportunity to produce drone comb, that they don't make as much of those burr comb drone cells like you notice when you're opening your hives in the springtime between your brood boxes. So that was kind of a discovery for me. But if you come up with queens that you don't want to promote, for example, you may notice that they don't produce honey very well, or you've had a disease problem with them, or if they're aggressive in any way, you don't want to use those in your operation. So you can choose different queens to use. So just on the glossary, talking about diploid again, I've got here paired complementary set of chromosomes, but that be an example of a fertilized egg, the egg itself and the sperm, and haploid, which would be the single set of chromosomes. That would be the unfertilized egg. So all a chromosome is the DNA strands that are many genes. And the gene represents your code for that specific material, that DNA, that is where we get our hereditary from. So this is an example of drone comb. This was just taken recently, a few weeks back, and how much they filled it up. I don't do this in every colony, but I usually do it towards the outside, either number 9 or 10 or 1 or 2. But when they want drones, they'll make a good filling of it. And I just checked a few colonies today with all the swarming that we've had. When they don't want drones, all the drones have hatched. They will fill it up with nectar, and they will cap it over eventually. But there's a good number of drones on here that you can see that are mixed. So the queen in this colony originally was both Italian and Carniolan. She might look Italian, but if you look on the drone that's on the upper left part of the frame, you can see that he's Italian. He has orange on his abdomen. And the one next to it up there at the very top is a Carniolan drone, but most of these look like they're all pretty much Carniolan from this colony. There's still a few Italians, but just an example of when you open your hives up and you might look to see if your drones are all one color or another or mixed, you'll know what basic type of bees your queen has been producing. More glossary. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. That's your string of combination of genetic proteins. Pheromone is a chemical that they use for communication. For example, Nasanov is one of the swarm chemicals that tells the bees to follow and land here, that kind of thing. You hear about resistance a lot all the time. That's something where, the colony or the bees are less affected by something. We hear resistance to, for example, mites becoming resistant to different chemicals we use in our hive over time. Why we need to make sure that we're using different methods for mite control. So this graphic is just a demonstration of the number of unfertilized versus fertilized eggs and the chromosomes. So in case you weren't aware, you do now, that bees have, in a haploid situation, 16 chromosomes, and in a diploid situation, the 16 and 16 is 32, where humans have 23 in a sperm or egg, and together fertilized egg would be 46. So when a drone is raised as an unfertilized egg, that's where we're getting that it's only representing what the queen has in her genetic contribution. So there's something too called a sex allele. That's kind of important to be aware of, and usually it shows up in your brood when you're seeing spotty brood. Sometimes it may not just be disease, it may be this variation of sex alleles, and this is a problem from inbreeding if you come across that and it's not disease related. Just to the left here, for an example, well, they come up with the possibility that there are 19 different of these, what they call sex alleles. And on the left, it represents a queen. She's got the red and the yellow, and the drone has blue. So there's a difference in the sex allele when she mates with that particular drone in the when she raises drones, or when she lays unfertilized eggs, of course, they're going to represent the queen. So that's why you have the yellow and the red drones. But her offspring, in the diploid side, the females, queens and workers, they're going to have a combination of the red and the blue, or the yellow and the blue. Over on the right side is just showing an example of when you have a drone that crosses with a queen that's got the same sex allele. Your drones will come out the same, representing the queen. However, when you have a worker that comes with that same sex allele, what happens is that doesn't develop into a worker. It develops strangely into a drone. The drones are supposed to be haploid, but it causes them to be diploid instead of coming out as a worker. And then the bees recognize that there's a problem, and they get rid of those eggs or larvae if it gets that far. And so that can create spotty brood. This is just showing gene combination. You've got one queen up here at the top, and of course bees are polyamorous, meaning they have many partners, so she can mate with 10 to 15 different drones. You've got the drones that would come from the queen would represent the queen, of course, but the combination of workers that you would get with that different many drones and the contributions of the sperm that she would get from them gives you a lot more combination of different types of females. So I hope everybody's still awake. We're getting towards the end, but what we're going to talk now is about the relationship of workers in each family, how closely or distantly they're related. And again, we know that queens mate with multiple amounts of drones. The average, I think, is 12, but it's anywhere between 10 and 15 it's supposed to be. So if we get into this, then we know that the queen contributes 50% of her genetics, and drones contribute 100% of theirs. So workers in a colony can be half-sisters related to each other because they have different drones or different fathers. And workers in that same colony who have the same father drone are what we call super sisters. The definition of super sisters are where they're 75% related. Half sisters are 25% related, and full sisters are 50% related. And the concept for this was given to us by Harry Laidlaw, who was at the University of Davis, or University of California in Davis, and he passed away in 2003. That's a picture of him. And just to go by the math, so when you have one queen and one drone, for example, to keep things on a simple basis, you have 50%, to do the math, I describe it as this. You have 50% contribution from the queen, 100% from the drone. Well, that equals 150, and divide it by 2, then you get 75 or 75% relatedness to each other. So those would be super sisters. And that gives them a higher relation to each other, even higher than being related to the mother queen. So I put this in a spreadsheet, so I periodically, when I'm raising my queens, I've got this definition with me all the time. So the description is that eggs fertilized from one drone sperm of a subfamily is much more closely related to workers termed as super sisters. And the math is over there again on the left. 50% plus 100 equals 150. You divide that by 2, and so their relationship is 75%. So I hope that makes it easier to understand. So when you open up a colony and you see different colored bees, you might see Italians, you might see Carniolans. And just to keep it simple, then the queen mated with 2 drones. One was Italian, one was Carniolan, and then what you're getting from the queen herself. When you see those, then you can say, for example, that the workers that are Italian looking are 75%. Those would be super sisters to each other. And the Carniolan ones would be super sisters to those. So this chart I didn't throw out, but it just explains the haploid diploid. The queen on the left being diploid and the drone on the right being haploid. When the queen lays an unfertilized egg, it's going to come out with the genes, with the queen's genetics. And for example, if you had just one drone that mated with this queen, and that can happen in a situation where they're doing oh, it's on the tip of my tongue now, where they're doing artificial insemination, AI. For example, then all the workers in that colony would come out as being 75% related to each other. So we're just keeping this on a simple term. Next, the bottom part of this graphic is a description for full sisters. So these would be queens, a queen in a colony that perhaps mated with 2 drones who happened to be, for example, out of a different colony, but they were brothers. So they're basically getting the same genetic material. And so that would be 50% from the queen and 50% from each of the drones equals 100. Divide that by 2, that's 50%. So you have workers from the same queen, and you have a queen that mated with 2 different drones, but they happen to be brother drones, so it's the same genetic material. So those workers would be 50% related to each other. They wouldn't be super sisters, but they would be considered full sisters. So I hope I didn't lose you. I'm gone a little bit slower, so we can try to get that. Then on the last part is half sisters. That's the very bottom part of the screen. That's where you've got a situation where the queen is only 50% related to each worker, and you've got different drones that she's mated with, so contributing different relations. They're all still workers in the hive, but they're in relative terms only getting 50% of their material from the queen, and divide that by 2, that's 25%. So they're considered half sisters to each other. And so they've got different relationships in every colony. Colonies that are highly related to each other, colonies that are half related to each other, and colonies that are kind of related to each other. So the half sisters would be workers with the same queen, but different drone fathers. So I hope that didn't throw you off too much, but just to go over it again, super sisters are 75% related to each other. Full sisters are queen and brother drones related, so that is 50% of their genes in common. And then half sisters are the same queen, but different fathers, and that makes them only 25% related. Everybody still awake? Great. So talking about drones and their relationships, they are, of course, 100% related to the queen. So just reemphasizing, they come without a father, but they had a grandfather. And all the drones in the colony are brothers to each other. So the queen's only 50% related to each drone, because remember, she comes from a combination of a fertilized egg and sperm. And so she could be, for example, all Italian if she got that genetic material combination, or she could be half Italian, half Carniolan. But every time that when you open up your colony, you can see, do all the drones look alike? Do they appear the same, or do they appear differently? Now, drones do drift from colony to colony, but you'll kind of know early in the spring when they start hatching whether they all look alike or they're different. So you'll know whether your queen is actually 100% of one type, or perhaps she's not. So, and just again, talking about the difference in sisters. And more of the math, it's just a different way of explaining it where I used it on the spreadsheet. So. So a repeated slide, I put it at the bottom. So these are some of the different traits: dominant, recessive, and then you've got certain genes that show both. And so I tried to keep a spreadsheet on this too, just for my own records. Under the dominant column, the dominant column, under the physical side, cordovan color is a recessive trait. I've got the dark as dominant. So if you get the combination of cordovan and dark, it's always going to show dark. Light colored bees are a recessive trait. So when you look at your Italians and you see some light colored bees mixed in there, you'll know that that's not a dominant trait, but they have some of that genetic. There's a wild type Italian color that would be dominant. Then we have black-eyed and white-eyed again, the dominant being black, and that's what I see all the time. And the ivory or the white-eyed color, that's recessive. But if you ever see the white-eyed color, you know you've got some of that in there. And then down at the bottom, we've got description for some of the behavior traits, characteristics. Under dominant, I have hygienic behavior. That could be, there's a little bit different where they could be cleaning things out, or they could be using their legs. And so that's some of the different behaviors. I probably need to go through and break that out. But the hygienic behavior, which I guess I need to, it's more than just cleaning, keeping themselves clean. It might be grooming. Well, I've got that listed at the bottom. Tracheal mite behavior would be a dominant trait as opposed to recessive. You know, there's some development in the brood where they come out quicker, or they grow faster, quicker in time. That's supposed to be a dominant trait. Mite protection, varroa mite protection, or uncapping is recessive. Brood removing under mite detection is recessive, and grooming, where they're biting the bees, or biting the mites and trying to remove them that way. And I suppose that they're probably doing that with small hive beetles also. That's a grooming trait, and that's recessive also. And so, you know, that's why it's kind of hard to hang on to those VSH queens, because once they're gone and they swarm off and you get a new queen, your genetics in the hive is going to change. And unless you're fortunate enough that they can pick up and mate with other drones that they get that, you know, recessive trait, you're really not going to see it any longer. And also apparently the mite detection, the uncapping, and the removing of brood is a multiple gene trait too. So this gets into more of the part of it where I was talking about perhaps the sex allele part. So I'm not going to get much into this, but it's a little more complicated because now we're involving more drones instead of just one or two. Whereas if you keep it on a simpler scale, I'm just talking about the drones. It's easier if you just use one or two. But this graphic is just talking about dominant versus recessive traits and how you can inherit both, but typically more recessive trait or less recessive trait is going to be expressed. An example of bees here, most of these are Italians. You can see the orange in them, and there are a few Carniolans. So again, just general guidelines and explaining it, how it works. The last couple of slides, I guess this is just to show you dominant versus recessive. And this was about how the mites became resistant to, the bees became resistant to the tracheal mites. And at the top, it shows a queen. She didn't carry the trait for tracheal resistance, but it's expressed in the drone. And when she produces drones, they're not going to carry this in the next generation, but the workers will be half and half, and any queens would be half and half. They would get, actually this mite resistant trait is dominant. And so you can see how you'd get some that would show that dominant trait and how they would select for breeding, for example. Down below, if you produced any queens from this group and she mated with another drone, you would see that your chances of increasing this dominant trait, when she produces drones, they would come out 50-50 as drone carrying that trait, and any workers would come out using that. So it's just an example of a dominant trait, and where you could possibly, where it's highlighted in red in that square, come out with a queen that would carry that dominant trait and pass that on for sure in both of her, from both of her sperm and egg contributions. So, so a lot of these graphics came from Glenn Apiary's. So this highlighted in blue is a fantastic site if you want to learn more about bee genetics. I haven't found any other bee site that really explains it any better. And they used to raise a lot of queens. I don't think they're in business doing that as much as they were 5, 10, 15 years ago. But that's where I would go if you want to learn more. And a lot of the information on haploid, diploid you can get from the bumblebee.org. And so that's it. So thanks for your patience. I know that has gone on for a while. So,
Bob, thank you so much. That was fantastic. If anybody has any questions, once again, if you click that chat button down at the bottom of the screen, if you move your mouse down over the screen and then down to the bottom, you'll see a button that says chat. You click on that, you'll get a dialogue a dialogue bar sort of either to your left or to your right side where you can ask questions that Bob can answer. There's a question from Brian here, Bob, that he's asking, is temperament of the queen dominant or recessive?
You know, good question. I think it's, yeah, I don't recall, but it is a genetic trait. And so typically, like I've been raising my own queens for 15 years, and I always pick from the nicest. And I can tell you, if you pick from your nicest and you want to promote it, it works. So I don't know if it's dominant. I think it's recessive, but it is a trait.
I wonder, Brian, if it's one of those things where it's so unpleasant that everybody is way on top of either getting rid of those queens or making sure that they breed from well temperamented bees, that it kind of doesn't matter because we work so hard to keep it out of our yard.
So I know, like in the Africanized bees, that although that's their trait for being highly defensive, that the reason they become dominant is more that their larval and pupa stage, their development stage is actually shorter than Europeans by like almost a half a day or 12 hours. So what happens is that they they develop quicker. And so your Africanized queen is going to have a better chance of hatching out before anybody else does. And then she goes and kills all the other queens. Well, that's why they end up taking over. So there's an example of, bee genetics right there at work. It may not be necessarily that the aggressive part is dominant, but that their larval development is quicker. And so they hatch out and take over that way.
Bob, I had another question for you related to a specific slide that you shared. You showed some queen cups that you had been putting you've been grafting larvae into to breed your own queens, and I was curious. You said you made those out of wax. Well, did you make those out of wax, or did you buy them pre-poured? And then my follow-up question to that is, there was a lot of royal jelly in there. Do you charge those with royal jelly, or is that what came straight out of your cells that you grafted from?
No, actually, so those cups I bought. I went on a trip to Georgia in early April, and believe it or not, this was from Rossman Apiaries, and I got a little tour of their production facility. I've used these in the past, but not as much. But while I was down there, I got a big bag for $8.
Whoa.
I ordered it instead of shipping it. And I don't prime or anything. In other words, I don't, you can read where some dealers will go ahead and put larvae in there, and then they go in 2 days later and take them out and put another larva in there. Well, that's a lot more work. And all this jelly, the bees when they're healthy and there's a lot of pollen out there, they just produce a lot more. And when you take the brood out, you look and you see all these white cells filled with worker jelly. Yeah, this just came off of the grafting tool that I used to put in there. So I didn't do anything.
Oh, Bob, we lost your audio.
Still there? No. So, still there? Yep.
Okay. Maybe it's me.
Can everybody hear me okay? I feel like I've lost audio. Okay, so I'm gonna, since I can't hear anybody, something happened wrong for me. I'm gonna try to turn Phil back on here and unmute him so that he can close us out.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Just shake your head up and down. Okay.
Yeah, I wonder what
Robert, that was very interesting. I was curious. So I posted a comment in there that since a queen mates with multiple drones that could have different characteristics, and then you're generating queens from the workers, from the eggs, one would think that you would have wind up with various queens with different characteristics from a single hive. You're still muted.
Oh, that's my fault. I have to unmute him probably.
Have you noticed that, Robert? Yeah, you can unmute your mic now. Or maybe not. Anybody else have any questions? So you need to put them, type them in the sign, the thing there.
Sorry.
Eric?
Okay. Yes, you could. So it's not a guarantee that all your queens would be the same.
Okay. I never really thought about that until you brought this up, and I looked with the characteristics like, well, I've got a queen here. It's just, really, all of her bees are really good and gentle, and you wind up with 10% of them that aren't. You happen to get the larva that's from a queen, from the male that's not gentle.
Yeah. I mean, chances are you're going to get some of her good genetics out there, but it's never a guarantee.
Huh.
And that's why every time you get a new queen, whether it's from a swarm or you bought it, that the genetics change.
And how many hives do you say you were running with new queens?
Oh, all the swarms, who knows?
Oh, okay.
I mean, I try to do 85 my own. I'm probably up to 100 now, and I help some other groups with theirs. And so there's probably another 15 to 20 in there. So it's about 120.
You stay busy.
Yes.
Anybody else have any other questions there? Well, if not, and just a quick thing about for next month, in newsletter, I think I made a comment that we're not able to use Bass Pro in June either. So just kind of stay tuned as what we're going to be doing for the June meeting. The more information will come out on that as we get a little closer. Who knows what's going to happen between now and a month from now. If this stuff flares up again, they may close things down again. Who knows what's going to happen. But Robert, I'd like to thank you. You did a great job. This is interesting.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. That was great.
Thank you.
Okay. Unless we have something else, we've made 3:43. We can go ahead and sign off, and thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you.
Eric, you can close it out now, I guess.
Folks, have a good rest of your week. Good luck with your bees.
Thank
Stay
you.
healthy.
Go feed your swarms.
Yeah. Take care,
That's what I'm going to do a little later. I've got to mow first.
guys. Take